Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's June 18, 2018, and this is episode 621. Just back from this year's complete Namibia tour, today we start a series of Travelogue style episodes to walk you through our antics as my group and I travelled this majestic land. I'm going to come right out and say that I believe this year's Namibia tour was probably one of my best tours to date, if not the best. I've been incredibly fortunate to travel with many wonderful people over the years, and everyone in this group seemed to just click with each other, which really makes my life as a tour leader very easy. And the photographic opportunities that we were presented with on this trip were incredible too. We started in Windhoek, the capital of Namibia, then drove down to a place called Keetmanshoop for one night to photograph the quiver tree forest there. On our way, we stopped to eat our packed lunches on the grass in front of a supermarket, and I had a very humbling experience that I'd like to share with you before we start to look at some images. Namibia has quite a high percentage of unemployed people and very little by the way of benefits to help those without work. As a group, whenever we have food left in our often too large lunch bags, rather than wasting it, we collect it together and give it to people that we meet on the road. We did just this on our first lunch stop, and after our guides had handed one man some food, I found a few other uneaten apples and sandwiches, so I walked over to this man to hand these over too. As I approached him, I saw that his hands were both already covered in the yellow grains from the cornbread that we'd given him. As I reached out to hand him the apples and sandwiches, he opened his mouth, showing me his teeth also covered in the yellow grains, and this is usually something that I'm not keen on looking at. He gave out almost a scream of delight and threw his hands out to his sides, then extended them forward to accept the food. I've never been so happy to see the food inside a person's mouth. It was a beautiful sight, but at the same time incredibly sad and humbling. I could hardly believe that we could make a man so happy simply by giving him a meal, and I was immediately reminded of the hardship that many people face just obtaining the food that they require to simply stay alive. We are so fortunate to live in a world where the next meal is almost a given, and I also feel incredibly fortunate to have been able to witness this humbling experience firsthand as we travelled in Namibia. We did, of course, continue to collect what we didn't eat, and I noticed that not only were people that were obviously struggling to get a meal accepted the food, but even officials working on some of the remote national park gates, etc., would gladly take what we could offer them. Please don't think that this is coming from some sort of an aloof perch, handing down our scraps. Everyone and anyone that we can help on this tour is treated with utmost respect, often with our local guides passing the food discreetly to the recipients. This is actually another reason why I felt so fortunate to have been able to have had the experience that I just mentioned during our first lunch, as I don't normally pass the food directly. Anyway, moving on to our first shoot, we checked in at a nearby lodge in the afternoon of day one and made our way to the quiver tree forest. We shot for a couple of hours to give the group a chance to stake out some nice places to shoot the sunset, and here is my shot to show you what it was like. I'm not much of a sunset person per se, but when we can get something nice and unique like the quiver trees in the frame, as well as a fiery African sky, it's hard to resist. I enjoy doing these silhouette images, looking for a spot with a nice main tree, then also trying to get some nice separation between the trees in the background, as well as a clear edge on either side of the frame. I was shooting with my 24 to 105mm lens at 27mm and struggled quite a bit to get a nice line of trees without too many bushes, like the one that you can see below the rightmost quiver tree. Still, the sky is lovely and it was an enjoyable shoot. My other settings were f14 and a 0.2 second exposure with ISO 100. Because of availability of some of the key lodges, this year I was not able to align our visit to the Quiver Tree Forest with a new moon, which would have allowed us to shoot the Milky Way. But there was going to be an almost full moon, which I was hoping to use to good effect. Rather than going back to the lodge for dinner then coming back out, I negotiated a late dinner to give us an extra hour in the forest as the moon rose. The result was this next photograph, with the moon illuminating the low cloud cover, but the stars also clearly visible shining through the clouds. We can also see how the moonlight has lit the base of some of the foreground trees, making them not quite silhouettes, but I like being able to see that extra bit of detail. I shot this with my 11 to 24mm lens at 17mm. Now, of course, shooting by moonlight, my shutter speed was 25 seconds at f4 and ISO 1600. At 17mm, you can't really use a longer shutter speed because the stars start to elongate if you do, and I didn't want that. This is why I chose to use a high ISO and wide aperture instead of a longer exposure. There is still some quite nice movement in the clouds though, and I really like being able to see the stars in the relatively bright sky. It definitely makes up for not being able to shoot the Milky Way here this year. The following morning we visited the nearby Giants Playground before breakfast to photograph the boulders silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, as you can see in this photograph. I like looking for faces in the rocks and pretty much did a repeat of one of my favourite photos from this location, with the boulders on the left looking like one of the Moai statues, and there is a large-chinned man in the bottom right, and a portly, somewhat Shrek-like face in the bottom centre of the frame. I shot a few frames as the sun got closer to the horizon, and this was the one that had the most intense colour. I really like the perfectly clean gradation between the orange and the blue here. My shutter speed was 1.3 seconds, again at f14, at ISO 100 and a focal length of 85mm. After breakfast back at the lodge, we checked out and drove through the morning to Colemanskop, the deserted diamond mine town, where the desert is gradually reclaiming the houses. This first image is one of my favourite scenes, and one of my first shots as I showed some of the participants where this particular house was. This small indoor sand dune has been there for 5 years now, since my first visit in 2013. This house is actually faring better than some, which are starting to succumb to the desert more quickly than others. I really love the colour contrast in this room, with the pastel blue being almost exactly the opposite colour to the orange sand on a colour wheel, and that's something that we're almost programmed to find appealing. This was a 2-second exposure at ISO 100, a focal length of 28mm, and, you guessed it, an aperture of f14. That's my go-to aperture when there's no reason to change it. It gives me enough depth of field at this focal length to get everything in the frame sharp. I continued playing with the colour in these beautiful old houses, working with a similar palette this time, with the orangey brown walls similar to the colour of the sand. There was also a hint of blue and teal coming from the left and right rooms at the back of this sand-filled corridor. Quite often, to shoot these images, I simply get far enough into the room to get past the doors to the sides near the entrance, just enough to give me a clear shot of what I consider to be a much cleaner scene, with fewer distracting elements. I also have a vertical orientation shot of this image with an old light shade hanging down from the ceiling included, and I think I prefer that shot, but the blog formatting works better with landscape orientation images, so that's what I'm sharing at this time. I shot this at 24mm f14 for 0.8 seconds at ISO 100. I pretty much always stick with ISO 100 unless there's a reason to change it as well. I'm not afraid to increase the ISO, of course, routinely shooting up to ISO 6400, but with no real wind requiring me to speed it up, ISO 100 it was. Something that I saw much more of this year was houses where the ceiling has literally just collapsed into the downstairs rooms, as we can see in this photo. I imagine this is mostly caused by the weight of the sand that accumulates on the floor upstairs, especially as the roofs succumb to the elements, allowing more sand in. Here, once again though, I enjoyed the contrast between the blue walls and orange sand. My shutter speed for this image was 4 seconds at ISO 100, so we can tell that the afternoon light was getting a little bit darker by this point. Again, my aperture was f14 and my focal length for this shot was 30mm. Next, I want to share one of the few photos that I've made of the exterior of the buildings at Coleman Scott. I don't do this often, as I generally prefer the colours of the interior, as well as the spectacle of having sand-filled rooms, but this particular scene caught my eye as we wandered from building to building. As you can see, the sand also builds up against the outside walls sometimes, and I thought that this straggly tree made for a nice element along with the window and the sand. I like cropping in tight like this, but here I was also forced in tight because I didn't want to include the frame of the door just to the right of this scene. I'm not a big fan of the grasses creeping into the frame on the bottom right edge, but I might spend a few minutes to clean that up at some point. It doesn't bother me enough to spend that time today as I try to get caught up on my work. My settings were a 13th of a second exposure at f14 and a focal length of 62mm. I changed my ISO to 400 for this shot as there was a bit of a breeze that may have caused camera shake in a longer exposure. As I mentioned, I noticed more collapsed ceilings this year than before, and here is another example of this. The roof seems pretty much intact here though, so I'm not sure what caused this ceiling to cave in. In this photo I do like the contrast between the still intact wash basin and sand and the collapsed roof. The fact that the walls are still pretty nicely decorated adds an additional element of contrast. Back in the shelter of the building again, away from the breeze, I'd returned my ISO to 100 and the shutter speed back to 4 seconds at f14, and now shooting with my 11 to 24mm lens at 14mm. Towards the end of the day, as I made my way back towards the entrance of Coleman Scott to our cars, I stopped at another favourite room, the relatively well-kept ice factory. I had earlier thought that this was just a workshop of sorts, but there is a sign on the door that says Ice Fabric, which I believe means ice factory, or to manufacture ice. With the sun almost on the horizon on the other side of this building, there was virtually no sunlight making its way into this room by the time I photographed it, so my shutter speed was 20 seconds at f14, ISO 100, and again using my 11 to 24mm lens, this time at 12mm. As I would have been standing in the precious light coming through the doorway, I moved down the steps and out of the way during my exposure. There's no point in blocking my own light. We're going to end this first episode with this, the last photo from day 2, as the warm light from the sun illuminated a side room at what I seem to recall being the old bakery. And here I was again using the one-point perspective composition that I talked about last year. I love the drama and tension that this kind of composition adds to a photograph. Again, I had to move to the side to avoid blocking my own light and leaving a shadow on the right wall in this image. We can also see the marks in the sand in the foreground of this shot from a recent relatively rare heavy rain that they had a few weeks before we arrived. This seems to have dripped in through the ceiling in this building. My settings here were a 25-second exposure at ISO 100, f14 and my lens wide open at 11mm. We'll leave it here for today as we've reached the usual 10 photos at which I like to limit my posts. I'm quite pleased to have been able to make time each evening to pretty much catch up on my selection process and most of the processing that I wanted to do on my images before finishing this trip. As we'll see, We end this trip with 4 nights at the Etosha National Park shooting wildlife, and that presents a bigger problem due to the number of images we shoot compared to landscape work. But I still pretty much was able to complete my preliminary selections before I started my flight back to Tokyo. After getting a few hours sleep on my way from Johannesburg to Dubai, then a few more hours at the start of my flight from Dubai to Tokyo, I was able to work on my image selection and processing for a further 6 hours on the plane, and that enabled me to just relax over the weekend and spend some quality time with my wife. It was really nice to come into my studio this morning with all of this work done and just get straight into selecting the images that I've talked about today. I haven't selected the images for the remaining episodes of this travelogue yet, so I don't yet know how many parts this will take, but I have a massive 363 images in my final selection, so I think we're looking at around 4, perhaps 5 parts to cover this trip, and we'll continue with part 2 next week. If you might like to join us on this tour from June 2 to 18, 2019, please check out the tour page at mbp.ac/Namibia 2019. It really has matured into an amazing tour, and I'd love to travel with you in this beautiful land. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share a link with your friends. Subscribe in iTunes or your favorite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. If you have a moment to rate the podcast or leave us a review in iTunes, that helps to keep us relevant in the huge number of podcasts out there now. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and Google+, etc. and links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with that part 2 episode, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week, whatever you're doing. Bye bye.